Hello and welcome to today's LaRouche show from the Manhattan Project and the LaRouche Organization, entitled Global Britain Dies in Afghanistan, Time for the LaRouche Doctrine. The demise of Global Britain was announced this week, not with a bang, but with a whimper. We illustrate.
On August 24th, Philip Collins wrote for the Evening Standard in an article titled Afghanistan, This Failure of Foreign Policy Encourages Tyrants Everywhere, and he said,
"The sorry truth about the desperate imbroglio in Afghanistan is that Dominic Raab would have been no less irrelevant to it had he been in a leather armchair in Whitehall, rather than on a sun lounger in Crete. In a way, Mr. Raab has done the nation a favor. A foreign secretary asleep on a sun lounger is the perfect visual metaphor for British foreign policy after Brexit and the demise of the American desire to police the world."
Lord Peter Ricketts, chairman of the British Joint Intelligence Committee during the Tony Blair administration, had this to say in response to Biden's withdrawal.
America's European allies have learned a lot about Joe Biden's foreign policy. In February, in an attempt to mark a departure from Donald Trump's America First campaign, the new U.S. president proclaimed that America is back. But in withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan, Biden has instead followed through on Trump's promise. His first public statement as the Taliban tightened their grip on Kabul were defensive and lacking in empathy for the Afghan people. China is likely to be the main beneficiary of the debacle in Kabul. Beijing is well placed to capitalize on its strong links with Pakistan to exploit Afghanistan's mineral wealth, wrap it into the Belt and Road Initiative, and thereby tighten its grip in Central Asia, all to India's detriment. Taiwan and South Korea may be revising their assumptions about the staying power of the U.S. as a military ally.
And finally, let's hear what former Prime Minister Theresa May thinks about all this.
I'm afraid I think this has been a major setback for British foreign policy. We boast about Global Britain, but where is Global Britain on the streets of Kabul? A successful foreign policy strategy will be judged by our deeds, not by our words. And I finally just say this. All of our military personnel, all who served in Afghanistan, should hold their heads high and be proud of what they achieved in that country over 20 years, of the change of life they brought to the people of Afghanistan and the safety they brought here to the UK. The politicians sent them there. The politicians decided to withdraw. The politicians must be responsible for the consequences.
The matter of the demise of Afghanistan and geopolitics as a whole, the matter of Southwest Asia, for that matter, are illustrative of a liminal change in the world scene, potentially as meaningful, for reasons that are not entirely obvious, as the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. What has happened is that the 30-year triumphalism of the neocon faction of the Anglo-American establishment has come to an end, a screeching, crashing halt. Now that the United States has irrevocably committed to withdrawing its military from Afghanistan, finally recognizing the intrinsic failure of the use of military force of any magnitude in that area of the world to address such a circumstance, is the transatlantic world ready to change its axioms? For example, would a President Martin Luther King have successfully applied the physical economic principle of nonviolent direct action to American foreign policy? Stated differently, what is the relationship between capital-intensive physical economic development of a nation, the rapid mastery of mining, manufacturing, agricultural, construction, and transportation skills by a nation's workforce, and a competent military strategy? Is there such thing as a nonviolent military strategy. Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman who founded this organization, campaigned for the United States presidency multiple times, not only because he understood that relationship of physical economy to statecraft. LaRouche also understood that the American presidency was invented by George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Ben Franklin to establish the primacy of that dynamic, productive relationship to physical economic production, rather than slavery as the basis for self-government.
I campaigned for President of the United States because I was the only person qualified, if that is in 1980, 84, 88. I campaigned because I was the only one, to my knowledge, qualified to be president under the conditions which the United States and the world was facing, the special conditions. And that's the only reason I ran. And I ran not necessarily to win, I ran because somebody had to stand up and tell the truth.
Mr. LaRouche, we have a situation that is unique in the world. We find ourselves before the new order. We have never had a situation where all the power, so much power was concentrated in the hands of a single man, as we have in the present case of the President of the United States. We call that new order in the Dominican Republic neoliberalism. Is there another way? Is there another option? Is there another way we can go outside of that new order?
Absolutely, and we must. If you go back to what used to be the principles upon which Christian civilization was based, which, among other things, prohibited the practice of usury and demanded the right of every family to exist, at least the opportunity to exist, because the production of the nation, the production of the individual, is a function of the family. In a family that cannot exist because of poverty, because of lack of opportunity, because of lack of education, misery, so forth, disease, then the person cannot exist, or the person is crippled, lives a crippled existence, and the nation cannot exist. When man is reduced to desperation, also he tends to become a beast. And when a nation's policy, such as a practice of usury of the type we have today, reduces a nation's desperation, the nation may be destroyed by that desperation. We have always recognized the moral responsibility of the state to provide the conditions of life. The one thing that is not understood is this, which I have laid special emphasis upon. Yes, individual enterprise is correct, but the state must take responsibility for basic economic infrastructure. Because basic economic infrastructure, which is water management, transportation, power generation distribution, public education, public health and hygiene. These are matters which cannot be divided into private entrepreneurships. These are matters of the nation as a whole. But the reason we must, as much as possible, in agriculture, in industry, have private entrepreneurship is because the ability of man to progress is based on the expression of the development of the individual mind, which is sovereign, which cannot be divided. It's an individual. That mind gives us, for example, scientific and technological progress. The existence of man depends upon this progress. Therefore, when we say to an individual, start a business, succeed, we are hoping to use his mind and the mind of his collaborators in that business to make an improvement in production, to create employment, useful employment, for the good of the society. And therefore, we need a form of society which meets these two requirements. No usury, commitment to the social justice of the people as a whole, commitment of the state to foster the development of basic economic infrastructure, and fostering, partly through education, the development of entrepreneurships in successful farmers, particularly family farms, successful small businesses, which may grow to larger businesses because they are good, they're prudent.
What were the special conditions that existed in the United States at that time that threatened its very existence, which caused Lyndon LaRouche to say that he was the only qualified candidate to run for office. By the way, the interview that you just saw was being conducted from LaRouche's jail in 1991, and he was running a campaign for president from jail in 1992. His vice presidential running mate was the Reverend James Bevel at the time. The conditions were illustrated by Lyndon LaRouche when he came out of jail in a particular diagram we're going to show you. It is called his LaRouche triple curve. And what he did was to illustrate in geometric terms the process that has now overtaken particularly the United States economy and the entire transatlantic sector, in which the lower yellow line represents true physical economic output of the economy, and the two above lines illustrate what most people call the economy: money and relevant speculative monetary instruments, derivatives, various mortgages, etc. And what has happened is that from 1971 in particular, from the time of the taking of the dollar off the gold standard, August 15th of 1971, until now, is that you've had a divergence between the physical productivity of the entire transatlantic sector, but the United States in particular, which has since 1970 been operating with a net loss year over year in its physical economic output. Contrasted to that, you've had massive increases in the monetary aggregates and financial aggregates, and we're now dealing with a bubble of over $2 quadrillion. It is unpayable. And the futile attempts by the various financiers of the transatlantic world to, in fact, get it paid are what are crippling the United States and the world and are causing conditions that caused, for example, the recent pandemic. The pandemic was not caused by a virus. That was an epidemic. But the pandemic conditions exist because of the way in which the economy as a whole has become poorer and poorer and poorer. The real economy, the physical economy. Next graphic, please. This is an illustration that LaRouche created to illustrate what he thought would be a meaningful, rational, sane division of the labor force. And our labor force today in no way corresponds to this. Rather than the idea of 15% administrative services or other forms of non-productive employment, that is the overwhelming majority of our economic processes today, particularly in the United States. And certainly the notion of over 50% of our population being involved in manufacturing, infrastructure, mining, and agriculture is a thing in the distant past, if it even exists in the minds of Americans. Next. This is an illustration from Lyndon LaRouche's So You Wish to Learn All About Economics and Other Economic Works, and is a way of showing how the process of industrial and agricultural production, the actual flow of production, works. It's worth, and I will just urge that all that would wish to understand how Lyndon LaRouche thought about physical economy, consult his So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. Next. There's the nature of the physical principle that LaRouche introduced is one in which you can think about the notion of capital intensity, technological intensity, energy flux density. There are many different terms, but the fundamental idea is, can one apply human creativity to the physical world in such a way to cause for example, an energy source to suddenly be far more efficient in its propagation? And we take here the case of light. We're taking the case of the Fresnel Lens. This was a breakthrough in lighthouse technology during the period of the early 19th century. On your left, you see a conventional convex lens, and these lenses were very heavy, and they diffused the light. What you're seeing on the far right is the design by the physicist and inventor Fresnel, in which he cut the lens, reducing the bulk of the lens immensely, and with a particular geometric design, created a way for a light source to shine much more intensely. Next. This is the lens from the front view and the side illustration. Next. And this shows the same light source that would be used by the earlier convex lens, which was much dimmer. And it shows that you have the same light source. So you are not using more energy. What you've done is you've changed the composition of the lens. If you will, you've created a machine tool, which can much more efficiently deploy the same amount of energy. And that is what scientific and technological progress brings to society. It's the essence of the core of what made not merely Western civilization, but civilization in China and so forth. It's the technological progress of those civilizations that uplifts mankind and allows for more and more people at a higher and higher rate of living standard to be born and to prosper. Next. This is merely the same, the machine of the lens with the light source shown from inside of the lens. Next. And this is the lens as a whole. And now you see it's in the way in which it exists in lighthouses, including off the coast of the United States. Next. This is a document, National Security Study Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests, also known as the Kissinger Report. And it was this document and the ideas of this document coming after the taking of the dollar off the gold standard that condemned the United States to a process and set of policies of no-win wars and of economic devastation, which is what has caused our economy to be so susceptible, not merely to disease, not merely to poverty, not merely to madness, but to the full dissolution of the United States. Lyndon LaRouche described and discussed the problem of the outlook that caused this document and other documents of its type to be written in the same interview to which we will now return.
The issue here is that, and I agree with Friedrich Schiller on this point, I think history bears it out, my case bears it out, that there are two tendencies in European civilization over 2.5 millennia. One is typified by Solon of Athens, who banned the usurers from Athens and established a constitutional republic. The opposite view of that time was Lycurgus's Sparta, which was divided into an aristocracy, a nobility, and slaves, helots. That Henry Kissinger and others who are my enemies because they represent the Sparta tradition. Example of the policy issue, which was the actual motive of Kissinger's and others for putting me in prison, is Kissinger's policy and the policy of his faction as identified by two documents from the 1974-1976 period, while he was Secretary of State and while he and then Brent Scowcroft were national security advisors to Presidents Nixon and then Ford. The first memorandum is the National Security Study Memorandum 200, signed by Henry Kissinger. The second memorandum, which is based on the first, is National Security Decision Directive 314, but it's signed by Brent Scowcroft in 1975. These memoranda said that developing nations are a danger to the United States because as their populations grow, they will demand technological progress and will become powers which challenge the United States' power to deal with their natural resources and so forth. Well, I opposed that because I was on the opposite side. I agreed with Boumediene of Algeria in 1967. I agreed with Pope Paul VI in Progressio Populorum, that the developing nations had a right to technological progress, and it was in the interest of the United States, in fact, that these nations have these rights. So there were two factions. Bush, Kissinger, others, the bankers, New York bankers, belonged to one faction. I belonged to another one. I became, in the course of the 1970s, late 1970s and 1980s, influential in the world through my collaboration with certain agencies of government, including the Reagan administration, the first administration. The people in New York viewed me as a power. Kissinger viewed me as a powerful person and said he must be destroyed. Whether I remain in prison or not is essentially at the pleasure of the president or the presidency. The legal grounds for removing me from prison by removing the sentence, removing the conviction, exist. It could happen within a matter of time. It could happen, as we say, under law sua sponte, by a federal judge. The evidence exists. As to whether that evidence and that procedure will be acted upon will be up to the political pressures acting upon the presidency. I am here because the president wishes me here, for no other reason. If the president were to change, then I probably would, the law would be allowed to release me from prison.
What is it that the people who rule the United States today want? What is it that they are seeking in the long term? What is their aim?
Everybody, I won't say everybody, but in general, one has the impression that people are trying to find a rational explanation for the behavior of the government of the United States. That is the mistake, to seek a rational explanation. If you say, what is the irrational motivation? Then we can very simple, not difficult at all to understand. You have a president who's run by some funny woman in England who flies between London and Washington on her broomstick, Margaret Thatcher. She comes to George Bush. George Bush says, I'm not going to go into a war in the Middle East. She says, George, you're going to go to war. He says, yes, I'm going to go to war. What we're dealing with is we're dealing with ideologues who have utopian ideas, who believe that they must make these utopian ideas come true. They don't care about reality. They say, if we have enough power, we can make anything happen that we wish. We wish to have a one world order which the Anglo-American rule. We wish to have the population reduced. We wish to turn Central and South America and Africa and most of Asia into helots, slaves, and we like that. We like it. That's what we wish to do.
Entonces no hay integración con América Latina, no es cierto.
So it isn't true then that there's enterprise for the Americas of an integration with Latin America and the United States, free trade, North American common market, integration, and the sense you would understand it.
Let me put it in this ironic fashion. I eat a meal. I have a salad before the meal. I have a meat course. If I'm Italian, I have a pasta course before that. I have an after course, a meat course. Then I have maybe one or two different desserts. I have integrated all these elements into my stomach. That is the kind of integration of which these gentlemen speak.
Sparta versus Athens. Which way is the United States going to go? Well, we know which way the United States went, particularly from the time of the Kennedy assassination, and specifically which way the United States went after the fall of the Berlin Wall with the triumphalism of the neocons. War is wasteful. It is inflationary. It is by definition destructive. It cannot be the basis of an economy. Today in the United States, most of the actual productive forces of the United States are in one way or the other tied up with the American military. That need not be a bad thing under certain circumstances. But what would they be? And how would they come about? Before turning to that, we have to look, first of all, at who has tried to enforce this. We began by talking, of course, about the British imperial freakout about the withdrawal of their American troops from Afghanistan. But to understand how this process of influence in the United States has worked, let's remember a few things. Go back, for example, to President Barack Obama's 2009 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. If you go back and you review the text, you'll see that what Obama did was to make a kind of blasphemous attack on Martin Luther King's principle of nonviolent direct action in order to justify the Afghanistan surge of 2009, a surge now admitted recently, just this past week, to be a failure by the then Joint Chiefs of Staff head, Admiral Mike Mullen. Provides a kind of textbook example when you look at that, particularly from 2009 until now, of the failure to grasp either the strategic significance or the moral imperative of economic progress as the preferred mode of nonviolent direct action in both diplomacy and also with respect to one's own nation. That is, within and among nations, the best thing to do is to deploy something equivalent to the Army Corps of Engineers for various purposes of internal improvements, both within a nation and also in conjunction with other nations. The Belt and Road Initiative that has now been seen, particularly from China and the over 100 nations that have joined it, is actually an echo of the old policies of the United States, as, for example, initiated by President Abraham Lincoln in the form of the Transcontinental Railroad of 1861, the most important transformation in physical economy in world history up to that time. But these lessons are lost on the recent presidents. They're embedded in the very establishment of the office of the presidency by Revolutionary War veterans, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and they're codified in Hamilton's 4 documents on the public credit, the national bank, on manufacturers, and the constitutionality of the bank. We are going to contrast that view, which is a true American view, with the view that we've had. And that's a view that's come from people that, shall we say, have bowed to the crown rather than served the best interests of the United States. First graphic. This is a cover of a study that Lyndon LaRouche did back in 1982 called The Toynbee Factor in British Grand Strategy. Next. It was referred to Arnold Toynbee, a British historian, from whom we'll hear a bit later. And he was also a crucial member of British intelligence. Next. This is Samuel Huntington of the United States, author of various texts, The Soldier and the State, and also an important text called The Clash of Civilizations. Next. The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order has been a kind of hallmark Reader's Digest version of the actual policy, which went through sort of two different forms of expression, with the Samuel Huntington being the most dumbed down version. Next. The slightly more intelligent version was Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. And this was supposed to dominate post-1989 to 91 American foreign policy. It had actually been something that Brzezinski had begun implementing during the time that he was National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, during particularly the summer of 1979, when he instigated the war in Afghanistan by beginning the process of financing and arming what was then called the fiercely independent Afghanistan Freedom Fighters. Next. The actual origins, however, of Brzezinski's policy were Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis, actually relatively recently deceased British intelligence agent who lived for the last quarter century of his life in the United States and was located at Princeton University. Next. This is a picture of Lewis, and Lewis was responsible for something called the Bernard Lewis Plan, which was then later packaged as the Arc of Crisis, and then later called the Islamic Fundamentalist Card. Next. The Bernard Lewis Plan was this is on the left, you see the way in which he conceived of the world as opposed to what you see there on the right. You'll notice that Iraq is not on the map on the left. And you have an area called Kurdistan and many other areas. Iran is not there. Something called Persia, which of course is also called Iranistan, is on the map. So this was a proposal for redrawing the map of this area, and it was all being done ostensibly in the interests of puncturing the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. This was what Zbigniew Brzezinski in particular saw himself as dedicated to. Next. This is the Crescent of Crisis, Troubles Beyond Iran. This is a picture of this idea of this arc, which is also called the Crescent, and the Crescent because it refers to the idea of deploying Islamic fundamentalism against the Soviet Union. And that is exactly what Zbigniew-Brzezinski set out to do. Next. He wrote, "An arc of crisis stretches along the shores of the Indian Ocean with fragile social and political structures in a region of vital importance to us, threatened with fragmentation. The resulting political chaos could well be filled by elements hostile to our values and sympathetic to our adversaries." And it was this Zbigniew-Brzezinski who personally went to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, and stood on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, wearing for the occasion, a ostensibly Islamic headdress and garb, urging that there be jihad conducted against the godless communists of the Soviet Union. Next. This shows the actual face, the true face of what the neocons proposed in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, rather than take up the plan, the strategy that was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche from his jail cell, in which LaRouche first proposed the concept of a Eurasian triangle, an area between Bonn, Berlin, and Vienna of about 100 million plus people, but was the most, it contained the greatest concentration of skilled labor on the planet at the time. And that this area would be used as the engine, the catalyst, the motor of a new form of economic development, reaching out to the East and eventually to, of course, the Far East. That was the conception that Lyndon LaRouche put forward. It was a different conception, however, that came about. And there, you're seeing, of course, Dick Cheney in the middle, Leon Trotsky on one side, and Alexander Helfand Parvis, who was basically Trotsky's controller, on the other. That the concept of permanent war that we have been engaged in, including our foray into Afghanistan, the foray into Iraq, the foray into Libya, the foray into Syria, this is what must now be reversed, and this is what's causing the British freakout. What they believe is that the Americans are walking away from the British intelligence-inspired policy of the permanent war as seen in the Bernard Lewis plan / Arc of Crisis plan / Islamic fundamentalist card. Next. This is a piece that we wrote, was written in Executive Intelligence Review back in 1999 called George Bush's Opium War, and it included this text. Next. Shortly after, and remember, this was written in 1999. Shortly after the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Reagan-Bush administration launched a massive covert war against Soviet troops in Afghanistan through arming, training, and financing the Pakistani-based Afghan Mujahideen. That war is directly responsible for the vast increases of opium and heroin production in Western Asia since that time, and has played a major role in criminalizing the former Soviet Central Asian republics and the Caucasus, through which heroin trafficking routes to Western Europe and the United States now pass. The Reagan-Bush administration secret team encouraged the Mujahideen to grow opium and refine heroin to supplement billions of dollars of U.S. government funds provided for the war, what's called Charlie Wilson's War, for example, popularly. Unlike the secret war in Central America, the Afghan war was heavily funded by the U.S. Congress with strong bipartisan support. However, the official funds covered only an estimated 10% of the costs of the decade-long war against the Soviet Red Army. So yes, boys and girls, Charlie Wilson's war is a piece of fiction. It's true that Charlie Wilson did what he did. It's true that the $1 billion was given. But if you want to know where most of the money came from, yes, it was the drug trade. In so doing, the Reagan-Bush administration also helped to create an apparently semi-independent narcotics and terrorist network as typified today by a former U.S. protege, Osama bin Laden, 2 years before the World Trade Center attack. Next. This just shows, by illustration, the opium traffic from the period. This is a chart showing the 1980s traffic. and shows you basically the movement of arms into Afghanistan and heroin, opium and heroin out of Afghanistan. Next. And just important to have a conception of what happened when the United States entered. What you're seeing on the left in the gray line, the light line, is Afghanistan's opium production. And you see it going from the 1980s period through 1990s. You see the increase. You see a precipitous drop-off. And that drop-off was something conducted by the Taliban. It's something that Pino Arlaki, who has appeared, Professor Pino Arlaki, who's appeared on our programs earlier, has illustrated, programs of the Schiller Institute earlier. And what happened was that just after the United States entered Afghanistan, the opium production went through the roof. So that is the, okay. So what I want to point out here is that the idea of military deployment for the purpose of solving problems, including a 40,000 person surge conducted by Barack Obama in 2009, had to end in the disaster it ended in. And the reason is that the wars, that the permanent warfare that was being fought by the neocons is never supposed to end. The purpose is war. The diplomacy is war. The economy is war. Why? Well, to get to that, what we have to do is to go now a little bit far into the past to talk to the true architects of these policies. And we can't really talk to them because they're deceased, but we do have some ability because of video and other audio that exists to visit for a moment with a few of the architects of British intelligence. So we're first going to hear from the Arnold Toynbee, against whom Lyndon LaRouche wrote his paper, The Toynbee Factor in British Grand Strategy.
When I started writing this book, I was still in this unreligious and slightly anti-religious state of mind. As I went on, not merely writing but living, I came to think again that religion was the important thing in life.
Now, you've also said that only a revival in religion can save Western civilization. Why do you say that?
Because I've come again to believe that it's religion that gives meaning and purpose to life. And after all, without purpose or meaning, what is human life? What can human beings do?
What kind of religious revival do you have in mind?
A very undogmatic one that would perhaps distress some of the orthodox in all the religions of the world. The essence, to my mind, of religion is a belief that there is something above and beyond ourselves, some spiritual presence in the universe, which we must get in touch with and wish to get in touch with, and which can help us and guide us.
Now, isn't there something to be said against a religious revival, which may possibly lead to fanaticism and violence? Because isn't it true that some of the bloodiest wars in history have been religious wars?
It's been the tragedy, I won't say of all religions, but of the Western group, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. They have been exclusive-minded and therefore fanatical. And if the revival of religion in these Western religions meant the return to fanaticism, that would be an almost prohibitive price to pay, I agree.
Now, Mr. Toynbee, are you a Christian yourself?
Orthodox Christians will not admit that I am, will not agree that I am, because on some of the most elementary points of the creed I should not pass muster. But I have, of course, been brought up in a Christian atmosphere and background, and my emotional relation to Christianity is bound to be different to that, my relation to other religions which I know intellectually but haven't lived inside.
Well, let me press you a little on this. Do you, for instance, believe in the virgin birth and the miracle? Wouldn't it be really true to say that you're just a humanist who has got vague supernatural ideas, which I suppose most of us have?
Well, no, not just a humanist. I'm on the other side of the line as compared to a humanist, because I do believe in this presence beyond human beings and beyond man. Now, a humanist thinks that the universe is just confined to mankind, by the highest thing in it. This is the crucial distinction, I think.
Mr. Toynbee, has religion been an inspiration and a comfort to you in your own life and work? And if it has, in what way?
Well, it certainly has, because after all, like everybody else who goes through life, I've had troubles, griefs, sorrows, And in those things, religion has been a very present help in time of trouble. Also, it's something that gives meaning and purpose to life. I think without religion, life would be rather a bad joke. With religion, it does seem to lead somewhere.
Now, in order to demystify what he's talking about, please consider that the Queen of England is the head of the Anglican Church. The religion that he is talking about, the presence above and beyond the mortal, is the empire itself. There is a religious commitment to the notion of the dominance of the world by perfidious Albion. And that is what he means, and specifically his criticism of the Western division of the religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that they're exclusivist. He means monotheistic. And so in their conception of creating, especially in this arc of crisis idea, which is an adaptation of this idea by Bernard Lewis, one should understand that the notion of empire at work in the minds of British oligarchical types is religious. We're going to next hear from someone that you've sometimes heard us talk about here, and you probably know that Lyndon LaRouche called him the most evil man of the 20th century. And that is Bertrand Russell from a 1953 interview.
Lord Russell, what do you think the world needs to reach a happier state?
Well, I think there are three things that are needed if the world is to adapt itself to the Industrial Revolution. The troubles we are suffering now are essentially troubles due to adapting ourselves to a new phase of human life, namely the industrial phase. And I think three things are necessary if people are to live happily in the industrial phase. One of these is world government. The second is an approximate economic equality between different parts of the world. And the third is a nearly stationary population. I'd like to say a little about each of those. As to world government, the world government should be, of course, a federal government, leaving a very great deal of freedom to the individual national governments, and only those things controlled by the world government which are absolutely necessary for the avoidance of war. The most important and the most difficult of these is armed forces. All the important weapons of war will have to be in the hands of the international government and of it alone. When that happens, war will become practically impossible. And if war were impossible, mankind could go ahead. If war is not impossible, every advance in scientific technique means an advance in mass murder and is therefore undesirable. But if once world peace were achieved, it would be just the opposite. That's the first point. Now I come on to the question of approximate economic equality. As things stand at present, Western Europe, and still more the United States of America, have a high standard of life. On the whole, the great majority of mankind live fairly comfortably from a material point of view. Asia, on the other hand, lives in very, very great poverty. So does most of Africa. And the moment people are sufficiently educated to be aware of these facts, the inevitable result is a great development of envy in the poorer parts of the world. That envy is a cause of unrest and inevitably makes world peace precarious. There's only one way of dealing with it, which is to produce approximate economic equality, which of course is a long story, but it can be done. The third point about population is very vital indeed. The food supply of the world tends at present to diminish through the denudation of the soil. It tends, of course, also to increase through various technical advances. But those two about balance, so that on the whole the food produce of the world does not increase appreciably. Now that means that unless everybody is to be very poor, especially if you have economic equality, unless everybody is to be very poor, there must be not more people to be fed, not many more than there are now. And therefore you've got to get approximate economic equality, approximate equality of population, and approximately stationary population. Otherwise, those parts of the world where the population increases fast will want to go to war with those where it increases slowly.
That brings us precisely to the problem of Asia and what part Asia will play in the immediate future.
Well, Asia, first of all, has risen to the point of education. Some Asians have, where it is not prepared any longer to be subservient to the white man. It hasn't noticed that Russians are white. If it had, it would take a different line. But it seems to think that Russians are yellow or black or some other color. And I think our propaganda ought to be mainly devoted to saying only Russians also are white. I believe that would be the effective propaganda to use in Asia. But I pass that point by. Asia clearly is going to claim equality with the white man. And it's perfectly futile, absolutely futile, for the white man to resist that claim. It will infallibly win, infallibly. And we ought, therefore, to concede it graciously at once before we're driven to it. To concede complete equality to Asia. But if Asia is not to overwhelm the rest of the world with a vast flood of population and poverty, Asia must live up to its responsibilities and must learn the sort of...
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the final side of that, but I think you get the point. We're finally going to hear from Aldous Huxley, author of The Doors of Perception, Brave New World, brother of the arch racist Julian Huxley, who was also the founder of, or rather first head of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. The great inspiration of the counterculture of the 1960s, and a man who died on an acid trip the same day that John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963.
Problem of the ultimate revolution. This has been very well summed up by the moderator. In the past, we can say that all revolutions have essentially aimed at changing the environment in order to change the individual. I mean, there's been the political revolution, the economic revolution, in the time of the Reformation, the religious revolution. All these aimed, as I say, not directly at the human being, but at his surroundings, so that by modifying the surroundings you did achieve at one remove an effect upon the human being. Today we are faced, I think, with the approach of what may be called the ultimate revolution, the final revolution, where a man can act directly on the mind-body of his fellows. Well, needless to say, some kind of direct action on human mind-bodies has been going on since the beginning of time. But this has generally been of a violent nature. The techniques of terrorism have been known from time immemorial, and people have employed them with more or less ingenuity, sometimes with the utmost crudity, sometimes with a good deal of skill acquired by a process of trial and error, finding out what the best ways of using torture, imprisonment, constraints of various kinds. But as I think it was Metternich said many years ago, you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you are going to control any population for any length of time, you must have some measure of consent. It's exceedingly difficult to see how pure terrorism can function indefinitely. It can function for a fairly long time, but I think sooner or later you have to bring in an element of persuasion, an element of getting people to consent to what is happening to them. Well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. This is seems to me the ultimate in malevolent revolution, shall we say. And this is a problem which has interested me for many years, and about which I wrote 30 years ago a fable, The Brave New World, which is essentially the account of a society making use of all the devices at that time available, and some of the devices which I imagined to be possible, making use of them in order to, first of all, to standardize the population, to iron out inconvenient human differences, to create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system. And since then I have continued to be extremely interested in this problem, and I have noticed with increasing dismay that a number of the predictions which were purely fantastic when I made them 30 years ago have come true, or seem in process of coming true, that a number of techniques about which I talked seem to be here already, and that there seems to be a general movement in the direction of this kind of ultimate revolution, this method of control by which people can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which, by any decent standard, they ought not to enjoy. This, I mean, the enjoyment of servitude.
The controlling oligarchy will presumably always exist. That is the religion of the British Empire and of their operatives. I don't think I need comment on what he said and your circumstance, my circumstance today in the world of internet and in the world of surveillance. The question is, are you a member, a disciple of the religion of the British Empire? Are you a member of the free and unaccepted church of the British Empire? That is the problem that we are dealing with today in America, in which a revolution of a very different type was made less than 250 years ago. And we are, in fact, about to celebrate the 250th birthday of our nation in 2026. Is there a kind of policy toward the world, foreign policy, that the United States is capable of initiating? Well, this was, of course, what John Quincy Adams, President of the United States, also Secretary of State, and the son of John Adams, kind of son of the revolution, literally, a person who at the age of 9 and 10 was actually acting as a spy on behalf of the American Revolution and was integrated into the intelligence services run by people like John Jay, Ben Franklin, Hamilton, and George Washington. And he crafted a conception and an orientation toward other nations, and particularly in terms of the United States' relationship to these nations. And he spoke about the fact that America does not go off seeking monsters to destroy. Well, that's precisely what the United States has been involved in, playing a kind of Othello to the Iago of the British empire, being the dog being wagged by the tail. We are offering a completely different conception of policy, and this is the thing that has been most notable about our work in the past months. And I think what's important is to say something about this in conclusion. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in her proposed coincidence of opposites approach to the positive resolution of the Afghanistan conflict, has called upon the United States to resurrect the classical idea of the American presidency as a sovereign interlocutor in foreign policy, separate and independent from the British colonial office, and I think also separate and independent from the Church of Satan or Church of England, depending on which way you want to think about it. I don't want to insult all people who are members of the Anglican Church. I simply suggest that one might check and see where the true theology of British intelligence lies. An American presidential response to Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and the other nations surrounding Afghanistan, taking the occasion of the present world medical crisis, for example, as a jumping-off point, should reassert the productive power of the United States rather than resort any longer to war, as Hamilton and Washington in particular would have advised. This past week, during her regular weekly webcast, Helga Zepp-LaRouche took some of these issues up.
Well, first of all, I find it noteworthy that Biden said something I think in response to some reporters. He said that, the Taliban is now confronted with the task to take care of the well-being of the Afghanistan people. And that is something which for hundreds of years was not attempted by anybody. Now, I thought that remark was extremely telling. First of all, it's true. The Taliban now is confronted with the fact that, the only way how they can maintain power, they have to address the hungry people. 1 of 3 Afghani people are going hungry every day, are food insecure. There is a very poor health system in the middle of a pandemic. So the Taliban must do something, to stabilize the situation, which is recognized by, as I said, the neighbors. And Biden addressed that. I thought this was important because that has not been a consideration by, NATO, obviously, because, after 20 years, they leave the country in an impoverished, terrible condition. So the British naturally are completely freaked out because they wanted to drag on. Boris Johnson had called the G7 in his capacity. I think he's Britain is chairman of the G7 for this time. So the meeting was convened and he did not succeed to convince Biden to prolong the date beyond the August 31st, which has been already rejected by the Taliban. They regard the NATO as an occupying force, and they want to stop that. And I'm not making judgment on everything the Taliban stands for, but they regard NATO as an occupying force. They regarded their war as a war of independence, rejecting the foreign occupation, and therefore they did not prolong this deadline. Now, that is now causing an incredible freak out. Tony Blair, the architect, or probably one of the architects of this entire unholy interventionist war policy. Remember his infamous speech in Chicago in 1999, where he basically said, now the Peace of Westphalia order is basically finished. We have to protect democracy and human rights. And that was the beginning of giving the theoretical underpinning for the right to go into somebody else's country, create havoc, millions of deaths, and then leave it, under shameful conditions. So this guy basically called the idea to end the endless wars an imbecilic policy. Now, attacking Biden, now that I think is very revealing, and there's a huge freak out ever since that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain is destroyed, it's finished. You have Lord Darroch, the former UK ambassador in Washington, saying this is the end of global Great Britain, global Britain. And, he was the one who had said we have to flood the environment of Trump to make sure that there's a complete controlled environment around it. Then he had to leave early in 2019. So there are other people in Great Britain absolutely beyond themselves, besides themselves. There is a certain Colonel Kemp, a former British commander of the British troops in Afghanistan, who said, unlike some Republican congressmen in the United States who demand the resignation of Biden, he said that Biden should be court-martialed. I mean, these people are completely off the wall. And there was one commentary which I thought was quite interesting, saying that, the fact that Biden did not consult with the British on, making this decision to not prolong the date beyond end of August, basically means that global Great Britain is just two empty words. And I think this is true because the special relationship between the UK and Great Britain, which was really the basis of this war policy, the unipolar world, run on the basis of the British Empire, you get the British brain and the American muscle to, subdue the world. That has now been blown apart. And, I think this is a very, very useful outcome, especially because everybody can see the shameful result of this policy.
Global Britain died in Afghanistan, but why should the United States follow? The United States has its own self-interest as a nation, not as a globally extended empire or a kind of policeman of the type that Smedley Butler, the famous American patriot, denounced in his book, War is a Racket. What we need to think about in the United States is the concept that Ray McGovern of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity introduced on our platform and the Schiller Institute platform as a metanoia, the notion of a sudden change in mind. People think about it as the idea of conversion. That metanoia is what we need, not paranoia. We need metanoia toward Russia, metanoia toward China, metanoia toward the idea of our relationship to the United States population itself. We've made a tremendous error. It's existed for a half century. We deindustrialized and we began to dehumanize. We have made poverty an inevitable circumstance for tens of millions of people when we know that it is not. And this sort of world outlook is not American. It's imposed on the United States, but also self-imposed. What needs to happen and what we can do is that we can take the idea of a World Health Platform involving the United States and all the other nations with significant industrial and capabilities, technological capabilities, looking at the idea not merely of vaccines, but what about clean water? What about sanitation? What about energy? So that we take these ideas of the original American Revolution's presidency, the notion that technological progress is the basis to overcome slavery, and we make this the hallmark of our nation. We should leave perfidious Albion to its own devices. As Bertrand Russell might once said, the situation may for them be unpleasant, but what of it?